Greetings, classists, and welcome to Book 17 of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus returns home in a more physical sense. So, one thing we're going to start with is this idea of using scholars. Now, for your longer essays, the 30-mark essays, for which you have 45 minutes to write, you must include academic scholarship. So, the opinions of scholars on the things that you are talking about. Now, one thing just to make crystal clear, you don't have to agree with those scholars, but you should have to show that you've understood their argument and analysed it. So, for example, Powell says, Telemachus is a sullen teenager who doubts his own parentage. So there's an element of that being a sort of pretty valid description, one might argue. But it's certainly an academic opinion too. That is Powell's opinion on the character of Telemachus, because others might argue against that. They may say that he's not a particularly sullen teenager, he's a frightened teenager, or actually he behaves more like a man. I would disagree, obviously, but there you go. So you would have within the essay, and it's important to relate it to the essay question as well, and be a little bit careful about that. But anyway, the key skills: identify the argument and evaluate them. So within whatever essay, you may have the idea that Powell argues that Telemachus is depicted as a sullen teenager. Now we've put sullen teenager in quotes because that's directly from Powell, but you don't need to necessarily quote Powell word for word. You can, if you can remember it, but if you wrote in your own words, Powell argues that Telemachus is depicted as a moody youngster or something along those lines. As long as you get across the sort of academic essence of the argument, then you'll be fine. Quotes are good, but not necessary. So once you've identified that quote, you would then put in your opinion, and you can agree or disagree, and that's an important thing to remember. Now, obviously, sophisticated students may well agree with part and disagree with part. So it is up to you as long as you analyse the quote. And the way that you analyse it is by obviously giving your opinion and supporting it with evidence. So evaluation would be something like the example on the screen. This is undeniable in the early stages of the poem when he complains about the suitors to Athene but takes no action. However, as the poem progresses, following Odysseus' meeting with Telemachus, he loses his sullen teenage nature and becomes more of a man. So Powell's argument is relevant to the first half of the poem, but not the latter. Well, anything along those lines. And you don't have to agree with that. The important thing is that you analyse. So what I'd like you to do is have a practice with the next phrase or statement. So this is from Graziosi, the book she wrote in 2012 called Homer. By turns a comic character, a tragic hero, a stoic sage and a villain, Odysseus could never and cannot yet be pinned down. So how can you turn that into your own words? Because you're not going to remember all of that. Can you sort of trim it to 3 keywords? Can you express it in your own way? If you're wondering about the meaning of the word stoic sage, or the phrase stoic sage, so a Stoic is a school of philosophy, generally one known for dealing with suffering in a sort of uncomplaining and rational fashion, and sage is a wise man. So a wise man who deals with his suffering. So what I'd like to do now is stop the video, whatever it is, and write down your response to this. So paraphrase or short quote, and what do you think and why, and you need to refer to examples in the text. Five lines, something like that, whatever it takes. If you end up doing more than that, that's great. If you're doing less than that, then you're probably not expressing yourself effectively. So well done. I'm sure you all stopped and did that, And it is now time for the book 17 test. So 70% pass mark, although that's absurdly generous, really. It should be 80%. That's what you should be aiming for. Well, actually, you should be aiming for 100. But if you achieve 80, 90, or 100, then you're doing very well. 70, you're okay. But remember, below 70, your knowledge is not going to be good enough to do the exams effectively. So make sure you're marking yourself honestly and taking appropriate action if you don't meet the pass mark. So stop, and 4 minutes, off you go. Boom. Okay, I'm sure you're stopped, I'm sure you'll do what you need to do, and I'm sure you're marking yourselves honestly. Remember, it's only yourselves you're cheating. So, book 17, Odysseus goes to town. So we see Odysseus and Telemachus leaving Eumaeus' hut and heading towards the palace. Now, Telemachus has done that in the previous book. Remember that it's important that Telemachus goes first, so that there is no suspicion that the two of them are working together, and Telemachus has got things to prepare and things to do. So, whilst Odysseus and Eumaeus are heading into town together, we get a little scene in the palace with Penelope. And here we get a very interesting little description from Homer. And Penelope is described as like Artemis and Aphrodite, which is a fascinating, sort of mutually exclusive comparison, if you like. So she's clearly divinely beautiful and deeply, deeply attractive. But remember, describing her as Aphrodite is a little problematic. There is, great sensuality or sexuality, lust, temptation, all of those things that Aphrodite is famous for. And yet that's fused together with Artemis, who is the ultimate in virginity and a sort of almost a desexualization of the female, if you like. So, a very, very, very interesting simile, and it hints at Penelope's character. And Penelope's character is an absolutely fascinating one because there are so many different ways of reading it. In some ways, she's explored in some ways, she's explored almost the same depth as Odysseus. In other ways, not so much. But we never really get Penelope's perspective, and I think maybe that's the difference. Odysseus, we get his perspective from books 9 to 12, but Penelope is mysterious to us, to Telemachus, to the suitors, and even to a large degree to Odysseus. I don't know if we ever really know precisely what Penelope is thinking and feeling. We've got indications. She's clearly not completely heartless. She's clearly not desperately sad. Well, she clearly is desperately sad that Odysseus is not there, and she loves Odysseus. And you can make some pretty sensible broad assumptions about her, but what's really going on in her mind? How far is she manipulating people? How far is she aware of what's going on? And a classic question to consider: when does she actually recognize the beggar Odysseus? As you read the book through, by the time you get to the end, she appears not to recognize the beggar Odysseus until a whole series of tests and Odysseus saying, "I am Odysseus." But then there are so many things that seem to indicate very strongly that she recognizes that Odysseus is the beggar, or at least strongly suspects that Odysseus is the beggar. So do keep an eye out for that. When do we have some evidence that maybe she suspects or knows? And there's no answer. There's no answer to that. But it's a fascinating thing when looking at Penelope's character. The other issue with Penelope's character is, how much is she really leading the suitors on? How much is she playing games? She's always in bed sobbing about Odysseus not being there. On a surface level, she does seem quite sort of weak and feeble, yet we get hints of her flirting a little bit with Amphimenus. The suitors themselves say, well, Penelope's the one leading us on in the assembly in book 2. So there's that deliberate air of mystery to Penelope's character. Anyway, that will cut. That I think I was just bringing that up now because we'll see that unfold over the next 5, 6, 7 books, and we've already seen it a bit previously to a degree, but just keep those ideas in your head. So, moving on, we see a little bit of Telemachus now back facing the suitors, and I think it's quite interesting to understand this transition of Telemachus. When we first see him in book 1, he's absolutely pathetic. Athene then intervenes and gives him bravery and courage, and he seems to develop more. Now, by the time of book 17, Odysseus and Telemachus have been reunited in book 16. Telemachus realizes that his father is finally there. He's got that kind of missing piece of the puzzle, if you like, in terms of his character, in terms of his development, in terms of his understanding of the way the world works. So perhaps we see a further development of Telemachus in terms of bravery and cunning. So let's have a look at this initial bit. So why does Telemachus want his wealth? Why doesn't he want his wealth brought to the palace after his little Odyssey, his Xenia gifts from Menelaus and Nestor? Well, quite sensible, really. He is terrified that the suitors will kill him and then obtain this wealth, and it's much better that the wealth stays with his friends. Perhaps he's also thinking of Odysseus. If Telemachus is killed, then his wealth is with family friends who Odysseus could go and recover it from. So I think we're starting to see, real development of cunning and understanding from Telemachus, and this idea of a hero protecting his teammate. And Odysseus does very much the same thing with the wealth that he gets from the Phaeacians, putting it in the cave of the nymphs on the beach in book 13. So, next question. What news of Odysseus does Telemachus pass on to Penelope? So, Telemachus does eventually pass on this. So he says initially that there's no news of Odysseus, no one's seen him alive, but then he does pass on the story that Agamemnon had heard about Odysseus being alive and trapped on an island. And this is potentially really quite revolutionary, because now Penelope has got a little bit more hope, perhaps. Although she's heard a lot of these stories before, this isn't the first time she's been given false news of Odysseus, as we discover. But is she now a little bit more aware that Odysseus is alive, maybe on his way back? Possibly. And as if to reinforce this, we then get Theoclymenus, Telemachus's, and this guest really reinforces the idea that Odysseus is still alive, but he goes further, and surely this must give Penelope more hope and make Penelope more aware of the possibility of Odysseus returning, either openly or in disguise. Because Theoclymenus says, I swear by Zeus, before all other gods, and by the board of hospitality, and by the good Odysseus' hearth at which I stand, that Odysseus is actually in his own country at this moment, or at rest or on the move, gathering information about these crimes and scheming revenge on the suitors. Witness the omen which I saw as I sat on our good ship and revealed to Telemachus. So, an important prophecy, perhaps a bit of a nerve-wracking prophecy in the sense of Telemachus, because does Telemachus actually truly trust Penelope? Has the scheme almost been rumbled? Well, I don't think so, but certainly it brings the idea to our attention, and it brings the idea to Penelope's attention. So will Penelope now be keeping an eye out for Odysseus when you have this beggar? I don't think so, but maybe. Penelope's a tricky one to read. Not only that, but he kicks Odysseus on the hip. So basically the butt, really. I think what that's saying is he kicks Odysseus in the arse. I think it's a modest translation from a slightly old translator. So, think about that, the insult that one of your own slaves is kicking you in the arse. The pressure to just go full hero and kill Melanthius must be extreme but Odysseus knows he cannot reveal his identity. So that's why Odysseus comes so close to losing self-control. Everything about his status has been threatened. This is, just the rage must be building at this point, but he can't, because if he kills Melanthius and someone sees, he could be hunted down and pursued by the suitors, even if they don't realise he's Odysseus, because Melanthius is their ally, if you like, even though he's obviously a vastly inferior status. He's working for the suitors. Then Melanthius makes things even worse by wishing death on Telemachus. And this is extremely important, because this is the servant or slave of a household wishing death on the master. So this whole scene, this whole story, if you like, shows the kind of moral decay that's overcome Ithaca or Odysseus's oikos. So some of his slaves are loyal, others are not loyal. They're loyal to people who have invaded his house and are currently destroying it. They're wishing death and destruction on their new master, and fundamentally the end of a line, the end of Kleos. So society is completely collapsing, completely falling apart. People who should have remained loyal have betrayed the oikos. Not only that, we see Xenia being threatened. So Eumaeus is bringing a stranger to the palace for Xenia, as Melanthius seems to know, and rather than being granted Xenia, Melanthius is suggesting that he be made to work. So again, what a corruption of society, how things have drifted from the straight and narrow now that because Odysseus was not there. So nothing really is holding society together. So a real sign of the impact of Odysseus not being there as head of the country is the wrong word, but as sort of head of the area and as head of the oikos. Everything is falling apart. We then come on to one of the sort of saddest scenes in the Odyssey, one might argue. So Odysseus and Eumaeus have walked past Melanthius. They've got past him. Odysseus has kept control, and they're walking up to the palace. And on a dung heap near the palace is an old dog called Argus, who had been a puppy when Odysseus left for Troy. So, Odysseus's dog basically has managed to stay alive for 20 years, sitting there for 20 years, waiting like a good boy for his master to come back. At this point, he is close to death. He's lying on the dung heap, covered in fleas and vermin. No one's been looking after him, but he's still remaining alive because he has that duty to Odysseus, this poor dog. And when he hears Odysseus's voice, his ears prick up, and he looks at Odysseus for one last time, and Odysseus sheds a tear for his beloved dog. And then finally, when Argus sees Odysseus, when he sees that his duty has been fulfilled, he dies, and his spirit is taken on to the underworld. So a very sort of moving scene for Odysseus, and another kind of challenge, if you like, to his identity. So, or to the concealment of his identity. So previously, it was, there's been a whole series really. So, he could have told his identity to Eumaeus to get better Xenia, but he wasn't entirely sure of Eumaeus's loyalty. He could have lost control and attacked Melanthius, and thus revealed his identity, or maybe put himself at risk through a sort of violent response, a heroic response. And now maybe he could have revealed his identity by an excess of emotion, so openly weeping at the death of a dog who he's never met, really, if he's never been to Ithaca much before. Or it would be strange for this beggar to feel great sympathy and sadness for a dying dog that's not really anything to do with him. one might argue. So another kind of challenge to Odysseus's skills in concealing himself. So a very interesting, sad little story, really humanises Odysseus. He has to conceal his tears from Eumaeus over his beloved dog. Argus is an interesting one. A very clear metaphor, one might argue, for Ithaca and the state of Ithaca when Odysseus is away. So Odysseus is away, things have fallen into disrepair. The society is on the dung heap, and it takes Odysseus to come back to put it all together. So Odysseus, having moved past Argus, then arrives at his palace and sits down on the threshold in what must have been a truly bizarre and strange situation, because for 20 years he'd been imagining crossing that threshold, the doorway, and receiving Penelope and all the praise and love and admiration from his staff, servant, slave, the soldiers behind him. And yet he's sitting there crouching in a doorway, and he can see a whole group of suitors eating him out of house and home, and Penelope off in the distance, who I'm sure he longs to embrace but can't. So when Odysseus gets to the palace, he then embarks on a sort of little tour of the sort of open palace hall, where he speaks to each of the suitors. And I think this is morally important, one might argue, because Odysseus interacts with the suitors and gives them a chance to show good Xenia. He explores, if you like, each suitor's responsibility, each suitor's level of guilt. And throughout the next couple of books, one could argue they are given a whole series of chances to repent. Penelope tells them to leave the house and go back to their home. Telemachus tells them to leave the house and go back home. There are omens, prophecies, signs that the gods aren't happy. There's all sorts of things that should be telling them, if they're good and moral people, that they have overstepped the mark and they need to do whatever they can to appease the gods, or Penelope, or Telemachus. And plenty of people disagree, but I think it's morally important that Odysseus gives them all, basically searches for evidence and gives them all a chance to repent of their sins. And it helps Odysseus understand who's who and what's what, as ably demonstrated by Antinous, who refuses to give Odysseus anything. So even though he's not even giving his own food, it's the food that he has stolen from Odysseus's house, he's not prepared to pass that on to a starving beggar. So that tells you all you need to know about Antinous. He's there absorbing huge amounts of Xenia from Odysseus and Penelope and Telemachus, and he's not even prepared to give a little bit to a beggar to stay alive. So he's utterly selfish, and the system cannot work like that. That is a real attack on the system from a mortal perspective, certainly. So we then get Odysseus telling a story to Antinous, and this, in a sense, is another or a very explicit kind of warning. So what I want you to think about is, how does the story serve as a moral warning to Antinous and all the suitors, and why is it important that the suitors are repeatedly warned? I guess we've kind of covered that, but what I want you to do is break down the story into little steps. What's going on with it? So I'm sure you stopped, and I'm sure you did that. First of all, Odysseus' story about him being some kind of pirate on Egypt and his men getting out of control and all that sort of stuff, that's the story. It's got some interesting warnings. So first of all, it's a reminder that Zeus punishes wrongdoers. Now, he doesn't necessarily make this a story about Xenia, although it could be read as one. But Zeus is the god of Xenia. Zeus is Zeus Xenios. So he's saying, when you commit crimes against Zeus, you will be punished. So it's a little bit indirect, but he's absolutely reminding Antinous and other suitors who are listening of this sort of moral cause and effect. You offend Zeus, you get punished. Now, interestingly, the crimes that Odysseus says he commits in this story are theft and destruction of property, which is fundamentally what the suitors are doing. So he's been quite clever in not directly accusing them, but he is highlighting this very important concept. If you steal and destroy property, you're punished by Zeus. It's quite a clear moral message. There's also this idea of the consequences of excess and passion. So as men lose control and they start capturing slaves, burning down farms, doing all these sorts of things. So, the suitors clearly have lost control of their passions, of their desire for luxury. They are behaving completely irresponsibly, and this is again another aspect of the tale. Here are people who gave in to their passions and were punished for it. This story also reminds you that the mighty can be brought low. So Odysseus, in his made-up story, was a great pirate with lots of ships and men and armies, and ended up a slave, an isolated, hungry, begging slave. So he's saying to the suitors, this is what can happen if you break the laws of Zeus. So an important little tale, and relatively simple, one might argue, in terms of its directions, but Antinous doesn't get it. And I think that tells you quite a lot about Antinous as a man. And we don't know whether the other suitors have heard and understood. We can imagine they have. We could also imagine it's simply a tale directed at Antinous, but I think it would have been quite a public confrontation, and the suitors ignore the story. And as we talked about before, this whole idea of speaking to all sorts of different people is important for Odysseus obtaining proof. So Odysseus has tested Antinous in terms of Xenia. He's tested him in terms of moral understanding and the laws of civilization. Antinous has clearly failed both multiple times, and thus is absolutely worthy of punishment. So what I'd like you to do now is pore through the book and see if you can list 5 examples from book 17 that help characterize Antinous, the chief suitor. So stop the video and come up with 5 points, maybe more. It's up to you. Good. So just some five ideas from me. So first of all, Antinous rebukes Eumaeus for bringing a beggar to the palace. So again, we've got this complete corruption, misunderstanding of Xenia. Antinous is at the palace seeking Xenia, and he's terrified that a beggar will have a few scraps of meat that otherwise could have been coming the way of Antinous. So he's hypocritical, he's greedy, and he doesn't understand, or doesn't seem to want to understand, the laws of Xenia. When beggar Odysseus is in the household, in the palace, he refuses Xenia to him. And again, he's not even giving away his own food. He's giving away Telemachus and Penelope's food, and he still won't do that. So, a lot of the similar stuff applies to the previous point. He objects to Xenia in principle, but and absolutely won't give it. In fact, even though all of the other suitors do, maybe a small point in their favour. Not only that, he then hits Odysseus with a stool. So in someone else's house, where he, in a sense, almost isn't responsible for the Xenia relationship, and certainly not responsible for refusing it or punishing someone for seeking it, Antinous hits Odysseus with a stool, a brutal and unpleasant approach to what's quite a reasonable and normal request from a beggar. He doesn't understand the moral point of the Egypt story, which is quite simple. So we see Antinous as a physically violent character, ignorant of the rules of civilization, and not very mentally sophisticated. He doesn't have the intellect of Odysseus, or Telemachus even, which is a shocking concept or thought. So he is, in some ways, a much, not quite a traditional hero, but he does have that sort of slightly brutish, sort of Agamemnon, Achilles kind of vibe to him as a hero, rather than the deeply sort of intellectual and cunning one of Odysseus. Now, not only does he not understand the story? Not only is he shown poor Xenia in a whole variety of other areas, he then threatens Odysseus with violence and torture. So he says, we'll drag you out by your legs and flay your skin off. So this is extreme in its misunderstanding of Xenia, in its brutality. And it's not Antinous' house. Although there is some insulting going on between Odysseus and Antinous, Antinous has no right to do this. And when someone approaches you for Xenia, not giving them Xenia is one thing, but torturing them when they approach you for Xenia is really quite appalling in the eyes of the gods, as Telemachus and others even point out during Book 17, and that doesn't seem to have any impact on Antinous either. So, he is a real bad guy. Some of the suitors are a little bit more ambiguous, Amphimenus, for example, and some of the others we never really understand their characters, although we assume they go along with trying to kill Telemachus, so they're certainly bad. We assume because they're still there, they're eating too much Xenia. So I think we can treat them all as a group in a sense, but Antinous is certainly the primary evildoer, if you like. So next activity is one on Eumaeus. So how important is Eumaeus to the plot and themes of Book 17? So you can come up with 5 or 6 ideas. So where is it that Eumaeus furthers the plot, so within the story, and where is it that Eumaeus demonstrates a theme or an idea, so beyond the plot, if you like? Stop the video and jot down some ideas. So, where can we see Eumaeus' importance to the plots and themes? Well, first of all, he actually defends Odysseus quite a lot. And this defence kind of, in some ways, diffuses the situation, or at least means that they're distracted a bit from Odysseus. I think Eumaeus is quite important in stopping these things turning into fights. And if Odysseus has a fight, there's a real danger that he will reveal himself. So he defends Odysseus from Melanthius, and he defends Odysseus from Antinous when they're in the palace. So Eumaeus is certainly brave, he's taking a risk, and he is showing impeccable Xenia, defending someone who he thinks is a beggar from the abuse of some much higher status characters. I mean, Melanthius is not much of a higher status character than Eumaeus, certainly higher status than Odysseus in theory, but Antinous, one of the noble lords of Ithaca, and Eumaeus stands up to him. That shows great honour and bravery, and it may help Odysseus conceal his identity by not fighting back. Although on the other hand, obviously with Antinous, there is the sort of exchange between the two of them, and Antinous fundamentally hits Odysseus with a stool. So Odysseus does have to have self-restraint in parts as well. Eumaeus also brings the messages from Telemachus to Odysseus to tell him to wander around the hall and when and where to meet Penelope, and that's important because Odysseus and Telemachus shouldn't really be seen together. Odysseus is the beggar, and Odysseus and Penelope shouldn't really be seen together either, because Penelope may recognise Odysseus, and Telemachus and Odysseus, if they're seen together, perhaps the suitors may become suspicious of Odysseus. Not necessarily that he is Odysseus, but that he is someone who Telemachus is working on a plan with, and then it could all go wrong. Because remember, the whole thing depends on Odysseus concealing his identity until the last moment, when he and Telemachus will be in this locked palace room with the only weapons available. In terms of themes, it is all about loyalty and the oikos. So Eumaeus is even though he's a servant, even though he's a slave, he has remained loyal to the oikos. And I suppose the other theme is obviously good Xenia. Eumaeus shows absolutely impeccable Xenia at all times. So back into the chronology again a little bit, if you like, to finish. We then get the setup for the long-awaited meeting between Odysseus and Penelope. Now, a couple of questions to think about. Why does Penelope want to meet the beggar, and why does Odysseus as the beggar refuse to meet Penelope at the time she suggests? So obviously Penelope has been meeting almost everyone who walks through her doors and questioning them about Odysseus. Have you heard from Odysseus? A kind of important part of Xenia, that you welcome someone in, but you do receive information from them. So Penelope is very, very keen to hear whether this beggar has got any news of Odysseus. And she's been told that this beggar is an old family friend. So it's not unreasonable to assume that he may have some knowledge of Odysseus. So we then get another interesting little bit of Odyssean trickery, if you like. Why does the beggar Odysseus refuse to meet Penelope at the time? She suggests, well, Odysseus says it's because he wants to avoid conflict and confrontation with the suitors. But I think there's another reason for it. Odysseus doesn't want to go to Penelope in daylight because he's trying to remain in disguise. He wants to be sitting in ever so slightly in the shadows of a flickering fire when he speaks to Penelope, because even if Penelope has remained faithful and loyal, if she just suddenly bursts out with the words, "Oh, Odysseus," at the wrong moment, then Odysseus is dead. She could unintentionally trigger the plan, but also so not trigger the plan, ruin the plan. But also Penelope may not be faithful. Odysseus does have to consider and explore and find out for himself whether she is reliable and trustworthy. So a classic little bit of Odyssean trickery, but also an interesting little bit of sort of Homeric writing. We're desperate to see what happens when do Odysseus and Penelope meet, and it's just delayed ever so slightly with the tension building. So now we know that this meeting will be a complex and fraught one. Odysseus can't reveal himself. Penelope is desperate for knowledge of Odysseus. Odysseus has got to control his own emotions and conceal his identity and try and find out the degree to which Penelope is loyal without revealing too much. A complicated exchange awaits us. Anyway, there we go. That is a talk through book 16. So well done for doing that, and I will see you in the next lesson. Bye. Say goodbye, Mimi. Thank you, man.